Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Education has for many years, of course, been seen as the key to social mobility, and certainly over the last 40 years or so, a wide range of social commentators, of academics, politicians have argued very strongly that the key to improving social mobility is, of course, education, and opening up education to people from a wider range of socio-economic backgrounds. And what I'd like to talk today about is how important is education for improving social mobility, first and foremost, and how important is it likely to be in the future. There have been some controversial studies, but nonetheless informative studies, that have suggested that social mobility in this country actually declined during the 1980s and during the 1990s. And in the 1990s, it certainly appeared that England, at least, was becoming a less socially mobile place. Since the 1990s, there's been an awful lot of investment in young people, in children. The last couple of years notwithstanding, there's been an increase in educational expenditure as a proportion of GDP. And possibly as a consequence of this additional investment, we have actually seen the gap in achievement levels between rich and poor start to narrow. Now, this has happened in a number of other countries, Australia, Germany, so it's not just restricted to England. But I think it's an important point that we should recognise. But there are still causes for concern at the high end of the ability distribution, so the more able children and those with higher levels of achievement. We find a very large socioeconomic gap. In the sense that our brightest here seem to do relatively poorly if they come from a poor background as compared to other countries, and that's obviously cause for concern. So what are the solutions if we think that we have this relatively immobile society, although it may have improved? First of all, I should say there's no lack of aspiration here. Research that we've done suggests that around half of all 14-year-olds from the very poorest families still want to go to university. So it is not the case, as you read in the newspapers, that young people lack aspiration, nor is it the case that young people from poor backgrounds lack aspiration. What it is that they don't secure the education achievement that they need to in order to go on to university. And that's a really, really important point. If we're going to make inroads, or continue to make inroads, in terms of social mobility, we need to raise the achievement levels of the poorest children. There's no shortcut to that. And what we do know from the studies that we have is that the gap between a rich and poor child emerges incredibly early. And that is obviously partly due to this intergenerational transmission of skill that we see. So if a parent has good skills, their children tend to go on and have good skills too. Now, just to be clear, this is not anything to do with genetics necessarily, but it is recognising the importance of the earliest environments that children are raised in. It's the importance of the parenting they receive. It's the importance of the role of the family generally. And the first point that I'd like to make on policy solutions is that if we're going to make inroads in terms of social mobility, we do have to broaden our focus somewhat away from focusing so much on schools and what they can do to improve the achievement of poorest children, and focusing on families, the children within their family environment, their home environment, their neighbourhood environment. It's not simply enough to start beating on the doors of schools and say, you must do better. And I think that's something we still need to work on. The second point I'd make is that the evidence is very clear that we need to intervene as early as we can. So it's very important that our interventions, like Sure Start, happen in the earliest months of the child's life. But it's not enough. The evidence from the US is clear on this point. If you simply intervene very early in a child's life with a fantastic intervention, you may improve their skills at that point. But if you're going to see them succeed in life, you have to have sustained investment over the entire life course. And certainly until they leave full-time education. So I think some of the debate that we've had about when we should intervene and which section of the education system we should fund is a bit false. We need to have early interventions, yes, but we also need to have sustained investment over children's lives. The other thing is, whilst I've said that a lot of the story is about the role of the family and the parents, it is also true that as the child progresses through the school system, poor kids do fall behind richer kids, particularly in later primary and early secondary school. So at the very least, schools are, on average at least, failing to close that socio-economic gap, if you want to think about it like that. And the question is why and what can we do about it? First of all, it's not enough that we keep kids in school longer. That's not going to do it. It's not enough that we increase the number of GCSEs they have, necessarily. It's not even enough that we get them more qualified if those qualifications aren't going to have value in the labour market. What we have to do is genuinely improve the skill levels of the poorest children in our society. It is very striking that in England, the value of even basic literacy and basic numeracy is incredibly high, much higher than in other countries. And there's a reason for that. That's because we have a shortage of basic skill, of basic literacy and basic numeracy in this country. And we need to do much more in our school system to move away from the focus of keeping kids in school longer and much more emphasis on the skills that they're actually acquiring. It's also about what skills that we'd call soft skills, okay, or non-cognitive skills. Self-awareness, self-control, the ability to plan, the ability to multitask. These are all skills that are highly valuable in the labour market. They also happen to be skills that many young people from most disadvantaged families lack. And one of the reasons why they lack this is because, of course, they're not getting the parental support to build those skills. But I'd leave you with a final point. There's also lots of evidence that inequality, and by that I mean inequality of income, and social mobility are inextricably linked. Yeah. There is some debate as to whether or not you could have a very socially mobile society with a very highly unequal income distribution. And generally, that's very hard to achieve. And so the more unequal we become, the less likely we are to achieve good levels of social mobility. And so whilst that has nothing to do with the education system necessarily, we do need to think about policies that are broader than just education when we're trying to tackle social mobility. Thank you very much.
My school is called Quinton Kynaston, QK for short, and I think it's a policy solution in many ways. I have a vision for education, which is that schools they shouldn't have to, but they can do the jobs that should be being done by the family. I do believe that in some situations, schools can replicate a family dynamic that for all sorts of reasons is missing. And I don't blame disadvantaged families. I don't blame families that are unable to support their kids. It's just a feature of the society that we live in. And it would be too easy, and there are many schools which take a view that says, this is not our business. Teachers are not social workers. We're not psychotherapists. We are trained to teach. We are here because we are passionate about our subjects, particularly in secondary education. At the time that I became a teacher, I had no idea whether or not I actually liked kids. I had no idea whether I could manage delinquent, difficult teenagers. And the people that are coming to teach in my school have to be so much more than just teachers. And when I recruit colleagues, and not only teachers, anybody that works at QK, what I'm saying to them first and foremost is, you come to this school as a role model, as a consistent adult in the lives of young people that don't have consistent adults. And 91% of the students at QK, we have 1,500 kids at QK, including 400 in the sixth form, 91% of them have a barrier to their learning for which we need to provide an intervention. We as a school are saying to these young people, bring all of your baggage into school with you. Whatever you have that is a concern or is a barrier to your learning, bring it with you, because unless we facilitate your working through the barriers that you have to your learning, even if you choose to leave your barriers at the gate, eventually they will come, and those little gremlins that are built up inside you will prevent you from being either a learner or an adequate adult parent when the time comes for you to take on those roles. So we welcome the opportunity to be more than just an institution that teaches students about learning. We also are an institution that gets 100% of our Year 13 students to university every year. And like my colleague here, we say to all of our kids, a university education is your right. It is your entitlement. Because you come from a disadvantaged working class background, do not be afraid of a culture which says you have to borrow the money to go to university. We can teach you how to manage your money so that you can pay that money back. Because in the end, if you want to transform the life chances that have been given to you, then you can do it, and you can do it in the right way. In the local estates that serve my school, 40% of our intake come from 2 of the most deprived wards in the country. The easiest option to make money quickly is to get yourself involved in the kind of gang culture and serious youth violence that we all know about. What we're offering to our kids is a much harder route through that says it's long-term gain. But what happens at the end of that is that you can look over your shoulder and be proud of the person that you are. And when you hear them talk about what they want for themselves, the idea that these are not aspirational young people is just ridiculous. This is my family. I was a very delinquent teenager, and I used my family and the unconditional love that came from my family as a secure and safe platform from which to take the risks that I took all the way throughout my adolescent years. QK kids generally, not all, but generally don't have this. So we could just wash our hands of them all and say, well, it's not our problem. We can't deal with it. We can't put the rights of society wrong in school. But we don't choose to do that. We choose to say, if you don't have this at home, then we will try and recreate that for you. So every single adult in the school represents the kind of family values and the kind of unconditional tough love that comes from being part of a secure family group. We don't permanently exclude kids. I never permanently exclude anybody because I believe that's a fast track to prison. What's the point? What you've got to do is keep working with these kids and show them that you'll never give up on them. So this is the first part of QK. The second part of QK is this sense that there is no glass ceiling, that there are high expectations for every single young person, which builds on the aspirations that they bring with them into school. And to support, again, what my colleague said, none of our kids have low aspirations. It doesn't matter what their backgrounds are. When they come to us for their first meeting in Year 6, and I talk about university, you can see the kids and the parents nodding their heads. They don't not see themselves going to university. They are totally aspirational. And what we do at QK is we don't allow anybody in the school to blame the kids for lack of high expectations. Nobody can say the reason that the kids don't do well in this class is because they're so badly behaved. That's absolute rubbish. What we say is, if you create a positive learning environment where every young person is engaged, for which you are accountable as a member of staff, it is amazing how the behaviour turns around. And I think that the marriage between a strong pastoral family support network, hand in hand with this forensically focused culture of continuous improvement and high academic attainment, is what has led to the results that we have academically, and the figure that I think is phenomenal, that is every single Year 13 student goes to university, 91% of Year 11s stay on into the sixth form, and 92% of Year 12s stay on to Year 13. So only 8% of QK students, bearing in mind the level of disadvantage, only 8% don't go on to university. Thank you very much.
I often think in discussions like this, a good starting point is to consider the purpose of education. What's it all about? And I think when people like me talk about education, when politicians talk about education, often it's a very utilitarian explanation of why education is important. And of course, the utilitarian case for education is a vital one for our economy. It's a vital one for people's opportunities in life, but it's only part of the importance of education. 10 years ago, Teach First was launched, and I had the privilege at the time to be recently appointed as the Minister for London Schools, and I'm very pleased that I gave the sign-off with Estelle Morris's support, the decision to back what was then called Teach for London and later became known as Teach First, both in London and then as the programme extended to other parts of the country. And I have to say, in 3 years as an education minister, it is without doubt one of my fondest recollections, the decision to give support to this programme and to have played a very small part in the wonderful journey that Teach First has made over this past decade. It's a bit of a Teach First themed week for me, because this time yesterday I was with Michael Gove in the speakers' rooms in Parliament at the Teach First reception, and a number of things struck me last night that have real relevance and resonance for today's discussion. First of all, very importantly, the depth of real cross-party support for the Teach First programme. It was set up under Labour, but it's being expanded under the Conservative-led government. And I say tonight, long may that cross-party support for this programme continue. But secondly, the vital importance that we continue to challenge the low expectations that sadly still exist in parts of our system. What we've just heard from Jo is a characteristically inspirational talk that I know is reflected in the remarkable achievements of her team, and the young people at her school. But we know that isn't the case in all schools, in all parts of the country. At the reception last night, Brett, the chief executive of Teach First, recounted a story that presses home a depressing reality in some schools, I think a minority of schools, I think a small minority of schools. He described a recent visit to a school in an area of great social and economic need, in which he was told by a teacher that a school couldn't turn coal into diamonds. What do you expect from kids like this? I think great progress has been made in challenging this kind of thinking, but I still think there is a lot to do to challenge low expectations, whether those low expectations are in schools, whether they're in wider communities, or indeed whether they are amongst parents. And thirdly, and crucially, the real life-changing impact that comes from excellent teaching and excellent teachers. At the event last night, Hang-En Chi, who is the head girl at Burlington Danes Academy, spoke to us, and she recounted the story of having arrived in this country from the Far East, from South Korea, 6 years ago, with very, very limited English, and her daily struggle to see it through the school day. She spoke eloquently of the inspiration that she had taken from her mathematics teacher, and how that teacher had equipped her with the confidence and the determination to realise her dream of studying to become a professor of mathematics, and she's looking to go on to study maths at university. So I think in coming to the question for tonight, is education the answer to social mobility? I want to say a resounding yes, of course, but also to say that education is one part of the answer. It's not the only part, and I'll return to that at the end. Providing rigorous and high standard pathways, both what we've traditionally termed the academic and traditionally termed the vocational, though I think that term is not a useful term in many ways, is critical when we address the needs of our modern society and the needs of our modern economy. We know that still far too few young people from the poorest backgrounds get those opportunities to gain places in higher education. Anna spoke about some of the progress that has been made, and it's very, very important that we remind ourselves of that progress, and she referred to some of the research. Another piece of research has shown that we're starting to narrow the attainment gap at GCSE, that family background had less influence on GCSE results of young people taking those exams in 2006 than it had done 20 years before. And this hasn't happened by chance. This has happened because of policy decisions that were taken. Some of the programmes that Anna referred to, crucially starting long overdue in this country to address the early years through programmes like Sure Start. The area that I worked on in government was the London Challenge. The London Challenge took the reality of a secondary school system in London that was consistently underperforming the rest of the country, and by a partnership between government, schools, local communities, including local authorities, we now have a secondary and indeed primary school system in London that significantly outperforms the national average. Very, very unusual for schools in a capital city. We know from the evidence that the biggest difference to educational outcomes in classrooms is about teaching and leadership, and both Joe and Anna have talked about this. Research from the Sutton Trust has shown us that the difference between excellent and poor teachers can equate to a whole year of learning. And Professor Dylan Williams from the Institute of Education has said that whilst 8% of performance in schools can be put down to the governance structures of schools, 80% is down to the quality of teaching. And yet in policy and political debate on education, we much prefer to discuss governance structures. We're not so full in our discussion of improvements in teaching and learning. So we need to focus on the levers that we have at our disposal. I think we need to learn from best practice, first and foremost in our own country. And I know it frustrates a lot of people in education that politicians are always looking to the Far East and Scandinavia and Canada. I do think we can learn from those jurisdictions, but I also think we can learn from what we've heard today from Joe and from the many other fantastic schools up and down the country. Anna talked about the limits to what schools can do, and I think it's important we address that as well. When this government took power, the department was renamed and the references to children and families were removed, and that wasn't simply a change of name. That was a change of direction away from the focus on every child matters, on children's well-being, on citizenship, and I regret that because I think it is vital that we have that broad approach. I've talked recently about the importance of speaking skills, speaking and listening skills, communication skills alongside literacy and numeracy. This old debate of skills versus knowledge, I think, is stale, but I worry the direction of government policy on curriculum is towards what I see as quite an old-fashioned view of knowledge that devalues some of those vital skills that both Anna and Joe have talked about: critical thinking, analytical skills, team working, as well as speaking and listening skills. And it's my view that many of these things are done brilliantly in our private schools, and if it's good enough for those schools, it should be good enough for children going to our state schools as well. On the demand side, we are seeing an economy that is contracting. We are seeing fewer opportunities for many young people. In a speech on social mobility in May, Ed Miliband said this: "We need to improve the supply and range of skills, but that is not the whole answer. Just as the debate about social mobility has focused too much just on university education, so too the debate has focused too much on educational qualifications to the exclusion of what is happening in our economy." Sometimes we overlook this important point. Yes, we need to build a better education system to equip young people with the skills and knowledge they need to compete for jobs in the future, but we also need the economic conditions in which to foster greater innovation and job creation. The economy right now isn't working. We need to challenge some of the long-held assumptions that both main parties have subscribed to that have produced this position. We need a new industrial strategy that helps firms compete on the basis of high value and not pay. We need to address the need for a more diverse economy. We need, as Anna said, however hard it is, to address the need for a more equal society. These are vital if we're going to deliver social mobility, but alongside that, we need to ensure that we have the highest quality of education in our schools, but also in our communities and families. If we can get both sides of that equation right, we might be able to forge a society that is both more mobile, but also, I think, importantly, more equal. Thank you.
There's more and more evidence, someone emailed me today, a speech made by Professor Terry Moffat at UCL, about the importance of self-control. And I'm interested in, what do we know about self-control as an attribute? Do you think it's as important as many researchers are now saying it is in determining children's life chances? And what do we know about how it is that we can increase self-control?
It is indeed valuable as part of a set of soft skills that might include other aspects such as, as I mentioned, multitasking, locus of control, the ability the belief that one can control one's own future. And interestingly, on the soft skills, there's increasing neurological evidence that these do not necessarily have to be developed in early childhood, that they can be influenced in adolescence, and therefore I think there's great hope there. The only thing I would say is that we know that they can be altered in adolescence. We're much less clear about what are the best ways to improve self-control, self-confidence and other soft skills in adolescents in terms of what should we actually be doing in schools. And I think that's an area where we still need to work on the best kinds of interventions.
A lot of people have heard about the marshmallow research, which shows that children who are able to resist eating a marshmallow when they're young, it determines their life chances. You wouldn't say it's not as simple as that. We couldn't just separate all children out by their marshmallow eating habits at the age of 3.
Well, you can separate them out by their cognitive skills at the age of 18 months.
Right.
That's not really the point, though, is it? It's because that's to say that they're fixed and unchangeable. Right. And of course, we can change people's cognitive and non-cognitive skills. It's just harder as they get older. And I think the evidence suggests that if you're going to change their soft skills, their non-cognitive, that is actually somewhat easier in adolescence.
Stephen, in relation to the question I'd like to ask you is, Anna talked about, and you talked about, actually there had been some improvements and some reduction in the gap, and Jo was inspiring about what happens at her school. Why is it, do you think, that we have this story of declinism about education? Why is it that everybody always seems to be on the verge of saying, oh, it's all fallen apart, the schools are terrible, the kids are awful, the gap's getting bigger, it's, you know. And as you know, it's a challenge for you as an opposition politician, because you can just entirely stick into a negative script about how awful everything is, and you can even be in government, it appears, and carry on with that negative script to justify whatever you want to do. So what is it about our national psyche that leads us to always believe that things are getting worse even when there's evidence that they're not?
A very interesting statistic in a survey a couple of weeks ago where people were asked about trust and who they trusted and who they didn't trust. I think politicians rated 10%. I'd quite like to meet the 10% who do still trust us, but teachers actually rated very high. Teachers were almost as high as doctors, and I think this feeds into a debate we need to have about the professionalism of teachers and how crucial enhancing that professionalism is to the future prospects of education. I think part of the reason, everyone has an opinion about education. We all went to school. Lots of us have kids or grandchildren who are in school now. Employers have a direct say. Everyone has an opinion, and often the negative thing that they see is what informs that opinion. Although the research seems to show, and it's a bit similar with other public services, that those who are directly using schools have a much higher opinion of the school that their child goes to than those who don't have school-age children and therefore looking at the system as a whole. So the media, I think, has a part to play. I certainly don't want to say it's all down to the media, but I think the media certainly has a part to play in this. There's an interesting contrast, and I'll finish with this point, Matthew, between attitudes to education, attitudes to health. Because I think there is generally a much more consistently positive view about the NHS. Even when people often have bad experiences, the general view of the NHS is much more much more positive than the general view about education. And I don't know the answer as to why that is, but I think the way we can start to turn it round is to have a debate that puts a real emphasis on the crucial role of teachers as professionals. And that's challenging for politicians, but I think it's also challenging for teachers as well.